Welcome, everyone. Good evening. I am so excited about this session. I'm Rabbi Sharon Brous. I'm joined here by my friend, Reverend Billy Honor and Rabbi Lauren Henderson, who are on the ground in Atlanta, Georgia. And the theme for this session is From Disenfranchisement to Dignity, Equity, and Access in Georgia and beyond. So let me introduce Reverend Billy Michael Honor. He is a public scholar, a civic organizer, whose progressive and compelling insights have made him a sought-after lecturer and social commentator across the country. He is currently the Religion and Racial Justice Fellow with the Aspen Institute's Inclusive America Project, where he's convening conversations about the importance of religious pluralism in the fight for racial equity and justice. And before that, Reverend Honor was the director of faith organizing for the New Georgia Project, where he still consults, which of course is the respected and now very well-known civic engagement and civil rights organization founded by Stacey Abrams, which many people credit with turning the Senate in this past election because of their absolutely extraordinary voter engagement work. I'll just share that I got to know Reverend Honor when I was down in Atlanta just before the midterm elections, and we had the most beautiful voter engagement gathering at Ebenezer Baptist. And then we were able to hit the road the next day, and Reverend Honor took me to all of the critical sites. My daughters and I were there to do some poll watching, poll monitoring, and to do something that would now be considered illegal in Georgia, in Florida, and other places, which is to bring food and water to people who were forced to wait online, sometimes for 4, 5, 6 hours in order to cast their vote. Reverend Honor, I'm so grateful to you for your incredible work and so thrilled that you're here with us for this conversation. Also joining us is Rabbi Lauren Henderson, who currently serves as the spiritual leader of Congregation or Hadash in Atlanta, Georgia. Rabbi Henderson is best known in Jewish Emergent network circles for her time at Mishkan in Chicago from 2016 to 2018. And then after that, as Mishkan's associate rabbi and director of family learning and spirituality. And before that, she was at IKAR in Los Angeles. So it's so wonderful to be with both of you and to engage in this really challenging and critically important conversation about equity, access, voter disenfranchisement, and voter engagement, and who we're called to be and what we're called to do in this moment. So let me set the scene a little bit for the book of Ruth, which is the context for our learning and conversation today. And then we're going to jump right into the issues. The book of Ruth, of course, is a story of loss, of love, and redemption. I think it's important to note at the beginning that this story takes place in the context of climate devastation. So remember, it's a famine that initially drives Naomi and Elimelech and their two sons, Machlon and Chilion, from their home in Eretz Canaan, in what would become the land of Israel, to Moab. They are climate refugees, and they have all of the vulnerability that comes with being refugees. When they arrive in Moab, they encounter even greater suffering there than they had faced before. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies, and Naomi is left a single mother, a foreigner, a refugee, incredibly vulnerable. The two sons marry, but shortly afterwards, they also die. So this family is experiencing tragedy upon tragedy. Naomi is broken. She urges her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, to return home to save themselves from the tragedy that seems to encompass her. And neither of the daughters-in-law wants to leave. They cry. Naomi's very persuasive. She sends them away. Orpah lovingly obliges, but Ruth insists on staying with Naomi. And here we have the famous words that echo across the generations when Ruth says to her mother-in-law, "Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and I'll be buried." And then she says, "This much and more may God do to me, if anything but death parts me from you." So Ruth and Naomi return. They are back in the land. They are impoverished, but they're together. Ruth, from hunger, is driven out into the fields to glean, and there she meets Boaz, her kinsman, and Ruth is seen, and she's protected, and she's redeemed by Boaz. They marry, and they have a child, and that child is named Oved. He, as the story ends, is the father of Avi Yishai, Avi David, the father of Yishai, the father of David. And our tradition says this is the line from which the Messiah will emerge. So this is a redemption story. It's a love story. It's a solidarity story. And for us this evening, this is the context for us to talk about what all of these things, solidarity and allyship and redemption, might look like in the current political and social climate that we're living in. So, Reverend Honor, I'm so touched by the way that I have heard you read and engage these, our shared sacred narratives, these texts that that come from the Hebrew Bible. And I would love to just start by asking you if you would reflect a little bit on this story and how this connects to the incredibly important work that you do, especially when it comes to issues of access, equity, and enfranchisement.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Rabbi Sharon. Really great to be with you. Always a pleasure. You are a bright light in our culture and doing so many good things. And so just really glad to be here with you. And to my new friend, Rabbi Lauren, welcome to Georgia. As you are still getting acquainted here, and we're really happy to have you here and look forward to all the great work you're going to do. I have so much great respect for the Jewish community. Particularly, I'm always encouraged by the ways in which sacred memory and remembrance is so central to Jewish identity. It's really important, particularly in a culture that tends to be ahistorical, as we are in America, and to like to misremember things. And so I think it's really important to have communities like yourselves who take time to remember properly your histories. And so I'm happy to be here. When I think about the question, it's really important to me when I think about what's happened here in Georgia over the last several years to interwove it with the sacred texts of our traditions, and particularly the Hebrew text, because it's really been a multi-faith movement that's helped to bring Georgia to where it is in many ways. It's been mosques, synagogues, temples, and churches that have come together in a very real way, and said that it's important that we use the theological and religious imaginations that all of our traditions bring to reimagine the way that our state can look when it is that we are bound together in a commitment to building civic power. In particular, when I think about weaving Ruth, it's really interesting to me because I always think of the book of Ruth as a localized and personal story. God is really not mentioned much in the text. It becomes a story about how it is we have to see the hand of God, if you will, as it moves through the actions and the fortitude of these women, really, who are pushing to creatively find ways to affirm their dignity and to secure their well-being in a social system that has put them in an insecure place. And for so many people who I meet as I've organized around this state over the years, that's the situation they found themselves in for a long time, feeling disenfranchised by the system, feeling made to feel insecure, undignified in some cases by the system. Rabbi Sharon, you mentioned the long lines of voter suppression. Those are ways in which people have been made to feel as though they don't matter as much as others in a civic way. And it was like Ruth and Naomi, two women. It was really largely a movement led by women in this state, similarly. Most people will know the name Stacey Abrams, of course. Her civic brilliance and genius is commendable and should be celebrated in the way that it has been. She's a gift to us, but not just her. Insay Ufat, the executive director of the New Georgia Project, Latasha Brown with Black Voters Matter, Helen Butler, who was on the ground before all of them for 2 decades here with the People's Agenda, which was started by now late civil rights legend. And so Helen Butler has been on the ground doing this work. All of these were Black women who helped to forge a path and build a movement about how it is we could collectively change our state. And we've been able to do that in many ways. Finally, I'll say, because I think what they understood was that there's no limit to the ways in which we can create change in our communities when it is we bring together people in a coalition who are rooted in affirmation of worth and dignity, a belief in the power of faith, right? A belief in the power of faith, and also a creativity of how it is that we come together to organize. What's different about what we've been able to do here in Georgia is that we've created systems where culture has to listen to us in the message that we bring, and has participated in this process. And so we have artists and we have influencers and social media influencers, whatever that means. All of those folks these days have come together into this movement, along with faith leaders and civic leaders, to really push the message, that we can have a new Georgia, and we're on our way.
Billy, and Sharon, I'm just so honored to sit with you, and I consider you both my teachers, and so really grateful to be part of this. And Billy, that was one of the questions that I wanted to ask, coming into this conversation, is to really understand the culture of what multi-faith organizing looks like in Georgia and throughout the Southeast. Before I got here to Georgia 10 months ago, I was getting more and more steeped in community organizing culture in Chicago. Chicago's known for this very deep culture of organizing, how it shaped the city. And so I'd really love for you to expand on, what does that faith presence and that multi-faith coalition building look like in the culture of organizing here in the South?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm really proud of the multi-faith coalition that's come together here in our state. I remember 6 or 7 years ago when we had a governor's election here. And for those of us who identified more as progressive, it wasn't a good election for us. It was a rough time out. I remember Reverend Warnock, now Senator Warnock, and I, after a faith forum that we were both a part of, we were so optimistic in some ways about that election. And then after it was over, we sort of looked at each other and we saw one another in another place, and we're like, this something has to change, is essentially the feeling that we had. And so part of what did change was that we began to understand that there is a coalition made up of Jews, Muslims, and Christians, Unitarian Universalists, Baha'i, and people who encounter God in spaces that might surprise other folks, all coming together and deciding that we may be movements by ourselves, but we're a real force when we come together. I think that's what we began to understand, but also understanding that multi-faith coalition building has to be intentionally done year round, right? Not just in an election cycle, right? So we committed to being together and working on issues year round that weren't just connected to electoral politics. So we started the multi-faith movement to end mass incarceration, right? We started to say, how can we as a multi-faith group of people reduce the amount of people who are incarcerated in our state and in our country as a way of building community among ourselves? I think multi-faith organizing is hindered sometimes when before we even come together, we try to work out all our differences and sit down and all that. That you're never gonna get there that way. Pick something to change in the world, start working together, and we can deal with, all the other stuff on the other end when we have better relationship. And so that's what we've done. And that's the movement that's come together in a lot of ways.
I want to just reflect on that for a moment. It's so powerful to hear you say this. And I really feel over the course of the last probably 2 decades that we're seeing the birth of a multi-faith justice movement in America, rather than just a few really critical relationships, but we're really starting to see a movement where we recognize that our futures are bound up in one another, that our liberation, our redemption is bound up in one another, and really that we belong to each other. And something that I have learned from many of my teachers, from Abraham Joshua Heschel, from Joachim Prince, who actually spoke at the March on Washington right before Dr. King, who came from Berlin, who is a rabbi who had made it to the United States, survivor. And what they and others have pointed out is that the solidarity between faith communities, between the Jewish community, which obviously is a multiracial community itself, but between the Jewish community and other communities of faith, and between many different communities that in particular have been under attack over the course of the last several years. That it is a solidarity that's born out of a kind of profound identification with one another, that on some level we really recognize each other as partners in the struggle. And we know that this isn't about sympathy. This is about engagement, really as allies, as partners, as friends. And I think the depth of the relationships, the individual relationships, is part of what strengthens that. So that's something that I want to talk and think about, just bringing us back to the text for a moment, if we can. There's a question about why we read the book of Ruth on this holiday, this Jewish holiday of Shavuot, where we celebrate receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai in the Revelation. And the Midrash says that the reason that we read this book in the first place on this night, that it's associated with this holiday, is because this story teaches us how great the reward is for acts of love, how great kindness and love can be, which is interesting because what that sort of suggests is that these people who, as I said when we started, are people who are in incredibly vulnerable positions, perhaps the most vulnerable, climate refugees who've experienced profound personal loss. They're impoverished, and if they are able to engage one another with acts of kindness and love, in a time and in a situation where one might be pushed toward more selfish behavior, or toward thinking about how can I provide only for myself and my own needs, how inspiring might that be for us to think in a more generous and generative way about one another. And in a sense, it seems very clear that the text is saying that love is at the heart of a just society. That love, when translated into real acts of solidarity, is what transforms a group of people living together to actually a loving, just, beloved community. And I want to ask you what you think about that, but I'm going to add a layer to it, which is that it also feels very clear to me that it's not just love. It's a law that meets that love and calls us to protect those who are most vulnerable to abuse when it's most necessary. So when Ruth goes out to the field to take from the gleanings of the field, what she's doing is in accordance with what we learn in the Torah, in the book of Leviticus, the mandate that those who have are required to leave the corners of the field and to allow the poor and the hungry to come and take from their bounty. And so in a way, what Boaz is doing, the whole story is structured on this legal system that's predicated on the fact that in a society there will almost inevitably be people who have and those who don't, and there will be abuses of power, and there needs to be a legal mandate that protects those who are most vulnerable so that we can live into our most loving and greatest aspirations. So I think this is both about love and also about law meeting love so that we are able to build the beloved community, not just in our minds and not just in our prayers, but actually on the ground. I'd love to hear how that sounds to you. What do you think?
I think that's such a beautiful pairing, that chesed and that gevura, the love and the strength and the law and the structure that is needed to build the beloved community. And when I was reading this story and you added this layer for me, I was thinking about Ruth going out into the fields and doing this gleaning, and because of the law, she was immediately visible to Boaz as somebody who was marginalized. Perhaps, without that law, he would have ignored her. But because of that law, because he saw her gleaning in the fields and collecting, he knows, he doesn't know yet that she's his kinswoman, or they have this family connection, but he knows that she's vulnerable, and he uses his power and his privilege to protect her. He recognizes that she's really at threat of being, violently exploited or mistreated in the society that she's in. So he says, stay close, stay here with my maidens, and I'll protect you and I'll make sure you're okay. And so I have, sort of different competing thoughts about that. On one hand, I think that's an incredible act of love and generosity that he performs. And on the other hand, I think, what about all the other women, all of the other people who are out there in the field? Aren't they also worthy of that love and protection? And what additional societal mechanisms or laws need to be put in place so that that access isn't just reserved for the people in the family, but for the entire society?
Yeah, no, thank you for those insights, Reverend Laura. That raises a lot of questions for me too about, so part of the fight that we've been involved in here in Georgia has been about access and how it is you either expand democracy, right? Or you try to limit democracy, right? And a lot of this fight, when people hear this term voter suppression, what you really should think about is civic and power suppression. Right, that's what's really happening here. It's not so much about the vote, really, right? It's what the vote symbolizes, right? The vote symbolizes, right, civic power of voice, right, of being counted or being represented. It's what it symbolizes, right? And what is really happening is you have particular groups of people who are afraid of what demographic shifts are going to mean for them, right? You talk about Rabbi Sharon, you talk about this sort of climate insecurity situation that forced the immigration, really, right, of Ruth and Naomi. Well, in many ways, what we've seen here in the South is people who have had economic insecurity, right, in other places of the country, who have been forced to migrate in the same ways and come to places that are more economically prosperous, where the dollar can, extend a little further. So those people have come here to Georgia, right, and other places around the South, signaling a demographic shift, right? And there are political entities that, rather than to put together a platform that would appeal to this new demographic, to expand the electorate, to expand democratic possibilities, rather than to do that work, they've decided they would rather try to choose their voters, change the rules, right? Or here it is, introduce laws, right? Because it goes both ways. In the way that the law can be used as an instrument of love, right? The law can also be used, right, as an instrument of injustice, right? That's why one of our famous theologians in the Christian tradition says that an unjust law is not a law at all, right? Right? That laws in and of themselves are only expressions of the actual values of the lawmakers, right? And in this case, these laws that we've seen in Georgia recently have been the opposite of that, right? They have actually been put in place. We could actually call them Hesed suppression laws, right? Because when you try to criminalize Hesed, loving kindness, compassion, right? Criminalize it, right? That's Hesed suppression, right? Because when people show up to the polls to try to show love and compassion as people of faith in a nonpartisan way, and Rabbi Sharon knows this to be true because as she said, she's been there, she knows that this is nonpartisan. We're giving water to whoever it is. We don't know who they're going to vote for, right? And so I said all that to say that in many ways, what we really have to drive is this idea that a lot of the injustice that we've seen, not just in our state, but that we're seeing all over the country, in the laws that are coming up, work counter to the type of lawmaking that we see in this text, or laws that were put in place really to try to serve those who were the most vulnerable in our society, right? And so that's really the great tragedy of it all, because there ought to be a process where our laws line up with the ethic of love that you've been talking about.
It's so powerful. I'm so glad and so grateful to you for spending the time with my daughters and me that day when we drove around so that I could actually see with my own eyes what was going on. And so one of the first polling places that Reverend Honor took me to that day was, I would say, 80 to 90% white voters. It was in an air-conditioned office building. We came in with water bottles and snacks, but people were in and out in 20 to 30 minutes. And then we got on the road and started to drive around to the majority Black communities. And I remember one of the sites that we went to, and we were unloading the trunk of the car, and we went inside, and there were 9 voting machines, and 7 of them mysteriously did not work. And people were, the line was weaving in and out, and people were there all day. And you think of, the incredible commitment that people made and had to make in order to just cast their vote. The most basic right and obligation of a citizen in a democracy. And the fact now, the kind of cynicism behind criminalizing those acts of chesed or acts of love, helping support people who are waiting on lines that are deliberately made longer because of mysterious voting machines, breakages and other things, is it's painful to see. And honestly, it's hard for me to understand how any person who calls themselves a person of faith could look at the most recent laws that have been passed in Georgia and in Florida now, and in many other states that are following suit, and not see this in its full nakedness. It's so clear and so obvious what's happening here. And I think that you're right that fear is very much at the heart of this. There's a failure of moral imagination at play. It was the dominant voice in our country for many years. I think that there was a lot of growth and movement and progress and opening up, and then it resurfaced as the dominant and mainstream voice for the last several years. And I'd love to think with both of you about about the imperative to engage in acts of sacred imagination now. What does it mean? And this applies to all aspects of these justice conversations, to all of the compounding crises of our time. What would it mean to think imaginatively about community safety, for example, about what it would mean for all people in this country to really live in dignity? I actually think at the heart of it is there's a failure of faith, and there's a failure of imagination. The failure of faith is, I believe that many people in our country don't believe that all human beings are created in God's own image. Even people who go to church every Sunday, even people who consider themselves religious, do not believe that all people are created in God's own image and therefore deserve to live in full dignity. That's the failure of faith. The failure of imagination is, well, even still, we have these systems, and this is the way it works. And sometimes there is injustice in the system, and there's nothing that we can do about it. And I think in this time, we're really called into this act of reimagining, of kind of generative, faith-driven imagining. And I'm curious to hear what that looks like for both of you in your wildest imaginings. What does beloved community look like? What do you believe America in its next iteration could actually look like if we take this mandate seriously?
Brother, I'm happy to jump in here. I think, so I've thought about this question a bit because part of what we encourage faith leaders who get involved in faith organizing to do is to begin to think about the ways they can cultivate theological imagination among their congregations, right? And a lot of times what that begins with is actually beginning to have conversations with people by asking people in your congregations or in your community a very simple question. And that is, what would you like your neighborhood to look like? Right? Like if it could look better, like what would your community look like if through your eyes in terms of its best self, right? And listen to those answers from multiple, because my grandmother used to say that all the sense doesn't reside in one head, right? That there's wisdom in the multitude of counsel. I think that's scripture. The rabbis will help me. But like I think when you listen to the answers that people give, then you begin to see, I think, something emerge, common threads, common themes that begin to become a sort of communal theological imagination, right? So part of the core of this, I think, one is having conversations with people, right? Like actually having conversations about what people would like to see differently in their communities and in the world. In addition to that, I would also say that another important part of this is understanding that rethinking America also means rethinking religion, right? Itself. That this theological imagination has to begin with a rethinking of what it means for us in terms of people who call ourselves people of faith, because whatever America is, right, faith contributed to it, whether we want to be honest about it or not. That at the core of what we have right now has a lot to do with the ways in which we have understood ourselves as people of faith or people in religious community. And so that's the other thing, is that this theological imagination has to reimagine what it looks like to be in community with other people in our faith traditions, right? And the last thing I'll say is I think that part of this theological imagination has to be also look like being willing to take a risk, right? I just think that so much of what we do is safe, and by safe, what I mean is that it's risky to a point to where we will speak these truths when we come out in protest. We'll speak these truths in places where we're expected to be subversive. But what we really need, if we're going to rethink America, is people who are willing to speak truths in places, maybe at Thanksgiving, right? With family members who were the ones pushing this agenda over the last 5 or 6 years, right? That Rabbi Sharon was talking about. Like, how do we begin to be subversives in places, halls of power, in corporate boardrooms, right? Because the real rethinking of America has to happen in places of power. As an organizer, I'm always asking who has the power, because you can talk all day. It only matters if the people who have the power to create change are going to relinquish it or be made to, right? And so part of this is even rethinking the ways in which we take risk, right, as people of faith, right? To begin to say, hey, we gotta do some things that are gonna shake some things up. That's why here in Georgia, we call for corporate responsibility of corporations to say, hey, look, you thought you were gonna be able to sit out on this and sit on the sidelines, but the people who pay money and make you rich, right? You have a responsibility to them, right? And so that's part of what we're talking about.
And that's been really transformative. I think, I mean, that's something that we've really, I wish that they had spoken out before the bill became law, but the fact that, I mean, that was national news, that these corporations are standing up and saying, these aren't our values, and hopefully that might move the dial. Lauren, what do you think?
So many thoughts are just buzzing. I'm remembering back to time is a funny thing. So I think it was about 6 weeks ago, over a month ago, when the shooter came to 2 different Atlanta spas and killed 8 different individuals, 6 Asian American women. And we were figuring out, on that day, how to talk to our religious school students about what had happened locally to our neighbors. And my partner, my educator that I work with, said just so clearly, this should not be happening. And I realized at that moment when she said those very simple, basic words, that there was a part of my soul and a part of my mind that had just sort of accepted the reality. Just to speak to what you said about the lack of moral imagination, part of me had accepted that, oh, we just live in a country where this sort of thing happens. And how many categories of our life could I go back to and realize, oh, I've just accepted this because accepting it is the price of needing to get through every single day and like be able to sleep at night. But maybe I don't want to sleep so well at night. Like maybe I actually want to live with more discomfort in the fact that this is not the world we want to live in. And we want to be able to say to our kids, this should not be happening on every realm of our society. And so I'm wondering, and I'm bringing this to the second thought I had, which is I now, for the last 10 months, have been serving a new congregation that is right on the edge of the city of Atlanta in Sandy Springs, and a fairly politically diverse congregation. And, a lot of different backgrounds, very international congregation. And I think about the blessing and the challenge of being in faith communities where we meet people that we might not meet anywhere else in the rest of our lives. And the kind of imagination that can happen, Reverend Billy, like you said, through that encounter with someone who is different from you. And how can our faith spaces be containers for those kinds of taking sacred conversations? Because like, whether that's at the dinner table, whether that's, at kiddish lunch, after services are over, I think we can push each other and we can learn from one another. And I think that is the holy work. And it's, I think often I am guilty of this, and friends of mine think, oh, I need to be a policy expert in order to make change. I need to go to grad school for 10 years in order to make any difference. But the work is actually, it's so hard, but it's also so simple. It is just that slow relationship building, witnessing, learning from one another. So I don't think it's rocket science, but I think it's hard.
I really appreciate that, Lauren. And I feel like we have a curiosity deficit in America. I think we're not curious about each other. We're not curious about people who don't look at the world exactly the way that we do, or think about the world as we do. We're not curious about people who didn't grow up the way that we did, who come from different faiths or different traditions. And I think that's part of the heart of the failure in the system right now. It makes me wonder what we need to do to create a new sense of wonder, right? You said earlier, Boaz could see Ruth in the field. Somehow he could see her. He is a wealthy landowner, person of privilege. And somehow this invisible woman became visible to him. And so how do we become visible to each other? And I'm really curious about that. I read a study that came out just before the election, in which the researchers found that 17% of Americans have no social connections at all. The way that they defined that was, how many people do you have in your life who you can trust and talk to about the most important things that are going on in your life and the world? And 17% of Americans said none. They can't process the world with anyone else. And then they went on to show that white people are friends with white people, that black people are friends with black people, that Jews hang out with Jews, that Muslims hang out with Muslims. And that both the social isolation and then the social reinforcement that we get when we do have social connections, but they tend to only be with people who look or think or believe a lot like we do, is doing damage to our souls, and it's doing damage to our politics. It's doing damage to the society that we're in. And so this multi-faith work that you were talking about, Billy, the idea that this movement in Georgia, and we saw this in the relationship between Senators Ossoff and Warnock, and I mean, they really like each other and they know each other. They have it seems there's a real friendship there, and obviously Senator Warnock has been in deep relationship with the Jewish community for many, many years. It matters. It changes your perspective. You grow in empathy when you're able to love people who aren't exactly like you. And it feels like at the end of the day, that's got to be part of the moral imagining that we're doing together, is actually doing the moral imagining together instead of each of us kind of conceiving of some imaginary future on our own, but really thinking and dreaming of it together. I want to say something about fear because you raised this earlier, and I'm very interested in this. And again, I'll draw us back to the text. You know, what the narrative shows us, intentionally or not, is that Boaz, who is the landowner, who's the one who has poor and hungry people literally eating the fruit from his field, he ends up winning or benefiting as much as the poorest and hungriest person wins or benefits from that arrangement. Meaning, I think we live in a kind of zero-sum mindset, especially in America, and maybe especially in this time. There's this sense that, like, what do I have to give up if you're going to get something? If you're able to vote and express your interests at the polls, what will I lose? How will that diminish my privilege or my standing or my rights? And so we have this zero-sum sense, like there's only a certain amount of rights or privileges or benefits in a society. And so if it's distributed equitably, the people who have are going to lose. And what I think the Boaz model shows us is Boaz ends up better than he was before he shared, right? He's the person of the most privilege in the story. And when he opens his home and his heart, he ends up becoming the father of the Messiah. I mean, he ends up becoming, like, not only does he have love in his life, but he has a redemption story that he's able to help birth into the world, which I think is really stunning. But it feels like part of the work that we have to do right now as faith leaders is help people understand that this is a positive sum, that love, that equity, that justice, that dignity, these are positive sum arrangements where the more that there is, the more everybody gets. And it's not, what am I giving up for you to have full rights and in this country, but what do we all gain when everybody's voice is heard?
No, amen. Amen. Amen to all of that. I think that's right on. And that is the work, right? At the core of modern oppression is two things. One is the perception of scarcity, right? And then two is a deep psychocultural fear of the other, right? When you look at any form of prejudice, whether it be racial prejudice, whether it be sexual orientation prejudice, we can go on and on. At the core of those is going to be one of those two things, right? A sort of deep psychocultural fear of others, which gets to what you were talking about before in terms of why don't we see people, right? Why don't we see others? Ralph Ellison said in The Invisible Man, I am not invisible because I can't be seen. I'm invisible because you refuse to see me, right? And so it becomes a situation of just what makes us not see people. And a lot of that has to do with that fear of other, this deeply psychoculture that we hide in wealth and class and other issues. But then I think what you're getting to is this other one, which is the perception of scarcity, right? That if in fact I lean into equity, if I support equity, then that means that I'm going to have to give up something. All of us have some sense of privilege that we hold on to. None of us are immune to this, to where we have to wrestle with it on some deep existential level, because the privilege is the way in which a lot of us find affirmation, right, in terms of our humanity. And part of what's counterculture, I think, about the best forms of faith is that we push against that and say that your affirmation as a human being doesn't have to be found in whatever it is you associate with social privilege, right? Right? That it's something much deeper, something much more transcendent, expansive than that. So I think pushing that is number one. But the other thing I'll say too on the other end is that it's also probably naive of us to assume that those of us, those systems and people who are in social power will arrive at these noble insights, right? Just for the sake of the common good. It's just not. It's just not how we're wired, right? We're wired to do the opposite. And so what I like about what Ruth did is that Boaz actually was looking out there, but I believe Ruth was doing things to make herself be seen, right? So that Boaz, she was trying to get his attention. So I think what we have to do is say, look, I don't care if you don't want to see me or you're trying not, I'm going to make myself be seen. And I think that those who see themselves as being rendered invisible in society have to stand up and say, I'm not going to allow you not to see me. I'm going to stand up in my fullness and totality. Frederick Douglass says power concedes nothing without a demand. And I think that's what we have to do, is we have to stand up and demand that we be seen and that our dignity be affirmed.
That's so beautiful. I'm just thinking about all of the gorgeous protests that I've been at, here in America and elsewhere, where theater and arts just played a really central role. And I think that, speaking of imagination, I think that's also what can open us up, because there's such an association back to that fear of the other is going to rise up and overwhelm us, and the us, whoever the us is, but so rooted in fear. And then when you see music and dancing in the streets and colors, and it just awakens something in our hearts, I think you realize, oh my goodness, the world would be just much more beautiful and transcendent, with that being able to actually see one another's gorgeousness. And I also just I love what you said. It really is making me think about what you said, that we are privileged. We often, the places where we are privileged, we see those as an affirmation of our humanity. But what would it mean to find the affirmation of our humanity in elsewhere, in other places, not through shoring up our privilege? That's going to sit with me for a little while as I figure out where that looks like in my own life. And then finally, I just wanted to say that when you brought up this question of fear, I think for me, where this learning has taken me is, and we could spend a whole hour talking about this, and I'm very curious what y'all think about this, but it's a whole other conversation, just about inherited trauma and how this is not just a product of this moment and this generation, but for each of us in different ways, it's something we have inherited back, not just 2 or 3 generations, but often many, many generations. And so this is the work of our hearts and our bodies as much as it is the work of our minds and our intellects.
I'm so glad you raised that, and I wish that our time was not up, but alas, we have to. We actually have to close. And so, I thank you for kind of recontextualizing this in the context of trauma. And I'll go back to where we started, which is Ruth and Naomi have experienced profound trauma and personal loss, and even from all of that loss and suffering, they become, for us, they manifest this story of love and hope and possibility and redemption. And I think there is a narrative arc to the story that's the foundation of this conversation, that's about moving from grief and loss into redemption. And I think there's a narrative arc to the moment that we're experiencing in history right now. And I bring us to the words of our friend Senator Raphael Warnock, who said as the polls closed and the results came in on January 5th, quoted Psalms and said, joy comes in the morning. And I think that we are in the process, the long, arduous process of ushering in a new morning that has been waiting for a very long time to be born here. And I feel blessed and honored to be able to do that with friends like the two of you. Billy, Michael, Honor, let me tell you, as we prepare for the next election in Georgia, which will look very different from the last because of these new laws. Ki el asher telchi elech, wherever you go, I will go. You tell us where to show up with water, with food, with support, and we will be there in defiance of these truly unjust laws and holding our deepest moral imaginings of what we can build together, a truly just, multi-faith, multi-racial America. Really honored to stand with both of you in this moment and in the days ahead. Thank you so much for making this holiday, the celebration of Shavuot, even more special and more meaningful for all of us. My blessings.
Thank you for having me.
Amen, amen. Thank you, both of you.